You know the name Sackler, you know the story. A wealthy family, a miracle pill called OxyContin, a marketing machine that claimed it was not addictive, and a death toll that rivals major wars. They made $20 billion. They destroyed hundreds of thousands of American lives. And they walked away with most of the money. But what if I told you they were amateurs? What if I told you that a century before the first OxyContin script was ever written, another family ran the exact same playbook? But they didn't just target a demographic. They targeted a civilization. They didn't just profit from addiction. They industrialized it, weaponized it, and turned an entire nation, the largest on earth, into their captive customer base. This family addicted millions. They shattered generations. They shaped the entire economic destiny of Asia. And when the dust settled, when the bodies were counted, they didn't go to prison. They got knighthoods. They got statues. They got their names carved into the stone facades of hospitals, libraries, and universities. Because that is how a true drug empire works. You make your fortune destroying lives. You launder your reputation through charity. And by the time history catches up to you, you are too respectable to touch. This is the untold story of the Sassoon family, the Rothschilds of the East, the opium cartel that built modern Mumbai, bankrupted imperial China, and walked away as heroes of the British Empire. And if you think this is ancient history, if you think we have evolved past this, look in your medicine cabinet. The drug has changed. The names have changed, but the con is identical. Let's go back to where it started. 1832. Baghdad, a city of ancient wealth and treacherous politics. David Sassoon, the patriarch of a prominent Jewish merchant family, is running for his life. The local governor is squeezing him, threatening imprisonment, extortion, or worse. David takes his family and flees. First, to Iran. But he is a man of vision. He looks at the map and he sees the future. He sees British India, specifically Bombay. It is a colonial boomtown, a port city exploding with energy. Cotton is pouring out. Silver is pouring in. And ruling over it all is the British East India Company. Now, you must understand that the East India Company was not a company in the way you think of Amazon or Apple. It was a corporate state, a monstrosity. It had its own private army, larger than the British Army. It had its own courts, its own laws. It controlled a territory larger than all of Europe, and it answered to no one except its shareholders in London. They had colonized India, not through diplomacy, but through pure, corporate conquest. They annexed kingdoms, they taxed the peasantry into starvation, and they turned an entire subcontinent into a profit extraction machine. And their biggest product, the one commodity that generated more revenue than anything else. It wasn't tea, it wasn't spices. It was opium. David Sassoon arrives in Bombay with almost nothing in his pockets, but he brings three things that are worth more than gold. First, the network. His father was the chief treasurer in Baghdad. The Sassoons were not just merchants, they were royalty in the world of trade. He has deep blood-bound connections across the Middle East. In a world without swift legal recourse, trust was the only currency that mattered, and the Sassoon name was a bond. Second, the knowledge. He understands how empires work. He knows how to read a court, how to bribe an official, and how to make himself indispensable to men in power. Third, the timing. He arrives just as the British Empire is solving its biggest economic crisis by turning India into the world's largest drug factory. But timing is useless if you don't see the opportunity. David Sassoon saw it immediately. He looked at the British operation and he realized something profound. They had created a perfect criminal enterprise with the full protection of the law, and there was an empty seat at the table for anyone ruthless enough to take it. To understand the crime, you have to understand the motive. Why was Britain pushing drugs? It came down to tea. By the early 1800s, Britain was addicted to Chinese tea. It was the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. Every factory worker, every aristocrat drank it daily. But China, the Middle Kingdom, wanted nothing that Britain made. British wool, too scratchy. British manufacturing, inferior. The Chinese emperor looked at the British envoys and said, essentially, we have everything we need. If you want our tea, pay us in silver. And so the silver flowed. Millions of pounds of silver drained from the Bank of England and vanished into China. The trade deficit was catastrophic. It was an existential bleeding that threatened to bankrupt the empire. The British tried diplomacy, failed. They tried selling other goods, failed. So they came up with a solution so elegant and so evil it changed the world. If China didn't want British goods, Britain would make them want something else. They would grow opium in India, massive fields of poppies cultivated under the company's iron fist. They would process it into a potent, addictive narcotic, and they would flood China with it. Suddenly, the Chinese weren't demanding silver for tea. Chinese addicts were paying silver for opium. The trade deficit reversed. India became the plantation. China became the addict. And Britain became the dealer. Let's be clear, this was not an accident. The British knew exactly what opium did. They knew it destroyed bodies. They knew it ruined minds. They restricted it at home. But in China, it was just free trade. By 1830, British India was producing over 1,500 tons of opium a year. The East India Company ran the monopoly. They licensed the farmers. They processed the drug in massive factories that looked like industrial slaughterhouses. They packaged it in stamped, standardized chests, and they auctioned it to private merchants. The government didn't ship the drugs themselves. That would be unseemly. They needed middlemen. They needed reliable partners to handle the logistics, the shipping, the dirty work. This is where David Sassoon stepped in. Most merchants in Bombay were content to be middlemen. They bought the opium at the government auctions, put it on a ship, and hoped for the best. They were gamblers. David Sassoon was not a gambler. He was an industrialist. He understood a principle that wouldn't be taught in business schools for another century. Vertical integration. If you want to build an empire, you don't just participate in the market, you own the market. Within a few short years, the Sassoon firm didn't just trade opium. They controlled the life cycle of the drug. They financed the cultivation, lending money to Indian farmers so they would grow poppies instead of food. They bought the raw product. They owned the warehouses where it was cured and stored. They built their own fleet of opium clippers, fast, sleek ships designed to outrun pirates and storms. They even founded their own insurance company to underwrite the risk, keeping the premiums in the family. And crucially, they established a network of agent Sassoon sons and cousins in every major port from Calcutta to Canton. While other merchants relied on translators and strangers, David Sassoon relied on blood. A Sassoon in Bombay loaded the ship. A Sassoon in Shanghai sold the cargo. The chain of custody was unbroken, but their greatest asset wasn't logistics, it was loyalty. The Sassoons positioned themselves as the perfect colonial subjects. They weren't rebels. They weren't agitators. They were collaborators. They made themselves indispensable to the British crown. When the colonial government needed a loan, the Sassoons were there. When they needed sensitive intelligence from the Middle East, the Sassoons provided it. It was a symbiotic relationship. The British provided the legal cover and the military muscle. The Sassoons provided the capital and the distribution network. It was the perfect partnership, and it unleashed a tidal wave of narcotics. By 1836, the Sassoon organization was moving over 30,000 chests of opium a year. Let's do the math. A chest weighed roughly 130 to 160 pounds. That is 4 million pounds of refined opium flooding into China every single year. By 1840, 40,000 chests. By 1850, 50,000. In China, the result was apocalyptic. This wasn't recreational use. This was the systematic poisoning of a civilization. Coastal cities began to disintegrate. You saw fathers selling their daughters to buy more smoke. You saw shops shuttered because the owners hadn't woken up in days. You saw the productivity of an entire nation crater. The silver that China had accumulated for centuries, the wealth of the Ming and Qing dynasties, began to flow backward. It poured out of China into the holds of Sassoon ships, and back to the vaults of Bombay and London. The Chinese emperor saw his nation dying, and he decided to fight back. In 1839, he appointed a special commissioner named Lin. Lin was that rare thing in a dying empire, a man who could not be bought. He arrived in Canton with a mandate from heaven. Stop the trade. He didn't negotiate. He surrounded the foreign warehouse district. He cut off their food and water. He demanded they surrender their inventory. And when the British merchants, arrogant and untouchable, refused, Lin held firm. They broke. They surrendered over 20,000 chests of opium. Lin Zexu didn't sell it, he didn't steal it. He dug massive trenches on the beach. He mixed the opium with lime and salt and he washed it out to sea. It was 1,400 tons of narcotics. Destroyed, it was a moral victory, a statement of sovereignty. But to the British, it was not a moral issue. It was a property dispute. And worse, it was a threat to the balance sheet. If China could say no to opium, the trade deficit would return. The silver would stop flowing. The empire's economy would stall. So Britain did what empires do when their revenue streams are threatened. They sent the gunboats. The First Opium War began. It was a massacre. The British Navy, powered by the Industrial Revolution, steam, and modern artillery, obliterated the Chinese coastal defenses. They sailed up the Yangtze, threatening to strangle the food supply of the capital. China had no choice. They surrendered. In 1842, they signed the Treaty of Nanking. History calls it the first of the unequal treaties. It forced China to pay 21 million silver dollars in reparations, mostly to pay for the opium Lin Zexu had destroyed. It ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain forever, and it forced open 5 new treaty ports to foreign trade. Nowhere in the text did it explicitly say opium is legal. It didn't have to. By stripping China of its right to enforce its own borders, the British and the Sassoons had won. The floodgates were torn off the hinges. For the Sassoon family, the war was not a tragedy. It was the greatest business opportunity in history. They were the first to establish themselves in the new ports. They expanded their fleet. They tightened their grip. While China bled, the Sassoons began to build. But enough was not enough. China, broken and humiliated, tried to resist one last time. In the 1850s, desperate local officials in the South tried to enforce their laws. They arrested dealers. They seized cargoes. They tried to stop the bleeding. Britain saw this as a violation of free trade. So in 1856, they launched the Second Opium War. But this time, they didn't come alone. The French, smelling blood and money, joined in. It was a campaign of absolute brutality. British and French forces marched inland. They smashed the imperial army, and in a final act of cultural genocide, they marched on Beijing. They looted and burned the old summer palace. It was one of the greatest architectural wonders of the world, a repository of thousands of years of art and history. They burned it to the ground to send a message: resistance is over. In 1860, China surrendered again. The Treaty of Tianjin was signed, and there, in the fine print, was the victory the Sassoons had been waiting for. Opium was legalized. The trade was no longer contraband. It was no longer smuggling. It was a legitimate, taxable, import business. The Sassoons stepped out of the shadows and into the blinding light of legitimacy. They didn't have to bribe port officials anymore. They didn't have to anchor offshore under the cover of night. They could unload their poison right on the docks, in broad daylight, protected by British law and international treaty, and the money. The money exploded. By the 1860s, the Sassoon family controlled 70% of the opium trade. They were the Rothschilds of the East. But David Sassoon knew something that every successful cartel boss learns. You cannot remain a drug lord forever. Eventually, you must become a gentleman. You have to clean the money. The Sassoons began to diversify. They took the millions of silver dollars flowing from Chinese attics and they poured it into the infrastructure of India. They built textile mills. They opened banks. They invested in railroads and telegraph lines. They bought vast tracts of real estate. Every rupee was washed. It went in as opium revenue and came out as industrial investment. And then began the greatest magic trick of all. The philanthropy. David Sassoon didn't hide his wealth. He showcased it. He transformed himself from a merchant into a benefactor. He looked at Bombay, a city teeming with poverty, and he began to build. He built the David Sassoon Library, a stunning Venetian Gothic structure that still stands today. He funded the Sassoon docks, transforming the city's commercial capacity. He built hospitals, he built orphanages, he built synagogues and schools. The people of Bombay looked up at these magnificent buildings carved with the Sassoon name and they didn't see a drug cartel. They saw generosity. They saw progress. They saw a pillar of the community. This is the playbook. You destroy 1 million lives overseas where no one can see the bodies. And then you save 1,000 lives at home where everyone can see the plaque. It buys you more than just goodwill. It buys you immunity. Who would dare investigate the man who just built the city's hospital? Who would question the ethics of the man funding the city's schools? The British Empire loved him. He was the perfect example of their civilizing mission. A loyal subject who generated massive tax revenue and built colonial infrastructure at his own expense. They showered him with honors. In 1853, David Sassoon became a British citizen. He was too orthodox to speak English well, but he spoke the language of power perfectly. His sons took it even further. Abdullah Sassoon, David's heir, didn't just want money, he wanted acceptance. He changed his name to Albert. He adopted the dress and manners of an English aristocrat, and the empire embraced him. He was knighted by Queen Victoria. Sir Albert Sassoon. He was made a commander of the Order of the Star of India. In 1873, he became the first Jew in history to be granted the freedom of the City of London. Think about that. At that moment, the Sassoons were more respectable than the Rothschilds. They had achieved the ultimate alchemy. They had turned the misery of a dying China into the glittering respectability of Victorian London. The drug lord had become the knight, and while the Sassoons were clinking champagne glasses in London ballrooms, wearing their medals and ribbons, in China, the century of humiliation was dragging on. A nation of addicts was sliding into chaos, rebellion, and collapse. But empires, even merchant empires, do not last forever, and the Sassoons were about to learn that when you build your castle on a foundation of smoke, the wind eventually changes. The end of the Sassoon dynasty did not come from a British court. It did not come from a market crash. It came from the very people they had exploited for a century. The year is 1949. The Chinese Civil War is over. The Communist Party has won. Victor Sassoon, the great-grandson of David, was the reigning king of Shanghai. He owned the Skyline, the famous Peace Hotel, the Cathay Hotel, the skyscrapers that defined the Bund. They were his. He lived a life of unimaginable luxury, throwing parties that became legend. But when the communists marched into Shanghai, they brought a long memory. They remembered the opium. They remembered the century of humiliation. They remembered the unequal treaties that had allowed foreigners to bleed their country dry. They did not negotiate. They nationalized. Every hotel, every bank account, every warehouse, every square foot of real estate the Sassoons owned in China was seized. Victor Sassoon fled to the Bahamas. He escaped with his life and whatever liquid assets he could carry. But the empire, the infrastructure built over 4 generations, gone. Overnight, billions of dollars in today's money erased. It was a brutal irony. The family that had helped break China was finally broken by China. Meanwhile, back in London, the decay was slower but just as terminal. By the mid-20th century, the opium trade was officially dead, banned by international law. The Sassoon business empire, stripped of its primary engine and its Chinese assets, began to wither. The family had assimilated too well. The later generations weren't hungry merchants anymore, they were British aristocrats. They preferred horse racing and country estates to the grind of global trade. By the 1980s, the once mighty firm was a shill. It ended not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic whimper. The British government declared 2 former partners of the firm unfit to serve as directors. The company dissolved. Today, the name Sassoon means almost nothing to the average person. If you walk through Mumbai, you will see the library, you will see the docks, you will see the statues. But the history, the origin of the money, it has been scrubbed clean. Time is the ultimate money launderer. Most people look at those buildings and see Victorian philanthropy. They don't see the ghostly fleet of opium clippers. They don't see the emaciated bodies in the streets of Canton. The Sassoons got away with it. And that brings us back to today. Because the playbook didn't die with Victor Sassoon. Look at the They followed the steps perfectly. Step 1. Industrialize addiction. They took a potent opioid, marketed it as safe, and flooded the market. Step 2. Vertical integration. They controlled the data, the marketing, and the doctors. Step 3. Philanthropy. The Sackler wing at the Met. The Sackler Gallery in D.C. Sackler Medical Schools. For 20 years, they were untouchable. They were the Sassoons of the 21st century. And even now, after the lawsuits, after the bankruptcy, after the public shaming, they are still billionaires. They paid a fine. They lost their name on a few buildings, but they kept the vast majority of the wealth. Their grandchildren will grow up in palaces funded by the destruction of the American working class. And they aren't alone. Johnson & Johnson, McKesson, Cardinal Health, the great legitimate companies of our time. They shipped the pills. They knew the data. They profited from the misery. They are still in business. Their stock prices are doing just fine. Because in this system, if you are big enough, if you are respectable enough, crime becomes a cost of doing business. So, what is the lesson? When you walk past a hospital wing, named after a billionaire, or a library endowed by a foundation, ask yourself, where did the money come from? Because history tells us that behind every great fortune, there is often a great crime. And behind the most respectable names are often the darkest secrets. The Sassoons proved it. The Sacklers proved it. And somewhere right now, the next dynasty is proving it again. They are selling a new cure. They are building a new wing at a university. And they are waiting for time to wash the blood away. Don't let them. Remember the names, remember the cost. Because if we forget, we are just waiting to be the customers of the next empire.